Welcome to episode 193 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts, and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Last week in episode 192, we read from chapter 16 of Francis Wright's A Few Days in Athens, and that chapter has an important relationship to what we're going to talk about today as we resume Book 1 of On Ends. Cicero has already stated briefly his objections to Epicurus, and Torquatus is now going to focus on the issue of pleasure. Torquatus says that this is where the real dispute lies. While that may be true from a practical perspective, Francis Wright's chapter 16 reminded us that the real elephant in the room is the issue of religion, and that most of our problems really arise from false views about the gods and false views about whether humans have immortal souls. So it's important to remember that you get to the question of how to pursue pleasure only if you first decide that there's no supernatural God who will send you to hell if you do so. Torquatus tells us that Epicurus says to look to nature for our standard of conduct, and he says that nature gives us only pleasure and pain as guides. As proof of this, Epicurus says that we don't need complicated logical argument. We can simply look around and see what nature has done with every other type of living being, and see that while these living beings are young and before they are corrupted by outside influences, they naturally pursue pleasure and avoid pain as best they can. We're now at the point in chapter 1 where Torquatus is going to address those who argue that the best life is one of virtue. In section 13, Torquatus says that those who find the good in virtue and virtue alone are dazzled by the glory of a name, and that they fail to perceive what it is that nature really tells us to do. Torquatus says that these people would be emancipated from the grossest error if they would just listen to what Epicurus and nature are saying about pleasure and pain. Quote, "For unless your grand and beautiful virtues were productive of pleasure, who would suppose them to be either meritorious or desirable?" Torquatus first goes through the four classical virtues, wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice, and makes basically the same point as to all four. Just as we value the art of medicine because it brings healing, and just as we value the art of navigation because it shows us how to sail ships, we value virtue not as an end in itself, but according to whether it is productive of useful results. In other words, virtue needs to be productive of something else in order to be worth doing. So today we're going to start with that question of how to look at virtue, and then we're going to turn back to the question of how to look at pleasure. And there we're going to find that Epicurus has not only advocated a new approach to virtue, in which whether an action is virtuous is tested by whether that action brings pleasure, but he's also advocating a new approach to pleasure itself, in which we include under the name of pleasure all mental and physical experiences which are felt to be painful.
There was a scholar, Cassius, named Stephen Prothero. I assume he's still alive. He wrote a book called God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World. The central claim of his book is against the idea that there is a monomyth or all paths to the same peak of the mountain, that the differences between different religions are not only quite broad, but also quite deep, that these different faith systems are making competing claims, and it actually really does depend on which one you choose, if it happens to be correct. Now, the opinion of Epicurus is that these religions, all 8 of them, are wrong. But he breaks it down into sections, and the sections are things like the way of salvation, the way of enlightenment. And so it occurs to me that the competing philosophy of the Greeks can kind of be put into the same sort of rubric. And so one of the major ones, of course, is the way of virtue. And so that's the central problem. And it's a problem because for the Epicureans, virtue is subservient to pleasure and not the other way around.
Right. Again, the context here is that Cicero has already stated his preliminary objections to Epicurus. And one of those objections is that Epicurean philosophy is totally unworthy of a human being. It's the most degrading type of approach that you can possibly have to life. And the implication of that argument, the basis of that argument, is that there's something bigger and grander and more virtuous that people are able to do, and as part of our nature, we should aspire to be. And so, as Torquatus says in this section, there's this idea that virtue is a glorious thing that we should all aspire to. And a lot of people think that that's a very compelling argument, and you can understand why. Everybody generally wants to be spending their time the best way they can spend it, and they want to think that what they're doing is worthy of their time and worthy of all the trouble that you have to go through in life. And so Cicero has criticized Epicurus by saying that Epicurean philosophy does not value virtue. And so the real context here is that Torquatus is launching into this argument to say, that's false, Cicero. We do value virtue, but we don't value it in and of itself. We value it for the rewards that it brings in terms of a more pleasant life. And Torquatus goes on to say this, that we as Epicureans establish virtue on a much stronger ground than do the Stoics or anybody else who's just saying you should pursue virtue for itself. The real foundation of wanting and needing and desiring to be virtuous is for the reward that it brings in terms of a happier life. And once you identify that as the compelling reason to be virtuous, you can reconcile the terminology and say, yes, we believe in virtue just like the Stoics do, or the Platonists do, or the Aristotelians do. It's just that we know that ultimately it is the reward that virtue brings that is important. And so that's probably what we're talking about as much as anything else here, to refute this idea that Epicureans are unvirtuous or just immoral. They are not unvirtuous, they are not immoral, because they've properly identified that nature's goal is to live happily, and that virtue is the tool for achieving happy living. These are tools for the production of a happy life. They're not things that Epicurus looks down upon. It's just that he doesn't worship hammers. He uses hammers to build buildings. He doesn't worship screwdrivers. He doesn't worship violins. He doesn't worship any particular tool for themselves, but for the pleasure that they bring.
Right. So it's crucially important whether you have the horse before the cart or the cart before the horse.
Yes.
Your answer to that question is it has real meaning. And Torquatus says that the life of men is most of all troubled by ignorance about the goodness and badness of things. And on account of this blindness, men are often robbed of the intensest pleasures and also are racked by the severest mental pains. And so he says we must summon to our aid wisdom, that she may remove from us all alarms and passions, and stripping us of our heedless confidence in all false imaginations. That wisdom is our surest guide to pleasure. Pleasure, of course, is the dux vitae, the guide of life, as Lucretius said, but you need wisdom, in other words, to know how to pursue it well. So that's the position. Pleasure is the goal. It's what we're striving towards. It's what we want to order our life in the pursuit of, but that these virtues have a role to play in getting us there.
Now, we will put a link in the show notes to our previous episodes where we went through these sections in great detail. I'm going to suggest that we skip down to section 17, which is after the discussion of each of these four. The last one being discussed is justice. And of course, every one of these, courage and temperance and so forth, every one of them is extremely interesting. But in the interest of time, and because we've already gone through these, let's move down to 17. Here's the summation. But if the praises passed even on the virtues themselves, over which the eloquence of all other philosophers runs riot, can find no vent unless it be referred to pleasure, and pleasure is the only thing which invites us to the pursuit of itself and attracts us by reason of its own nature, then there can be no doubt that of all things good, pleasure, is the supreme and ultimate good, and that a life of happiness means nothing else but a life attended by pleasure. So all of these arguments on these virtues condense down to this ultimate point that virtue is worth pursuing not on its own, but because it brings pleasure and therefore a happy life. So as we go then into section 17, here are some issues that we've not discussed as much recently and that will be very important as we get to Cicero's objections in Book 2. The first thing that Torquatus says in 17 is he says, I'll concisely explain the corollaries of these opinions I've been talking about. He says, people make no mistake about pleasure and pain, the standards of good and evil themselves, but they err in these matters through ignorance of the means by which these results would be brought about. And here's one of the first issues that is very controversial. Now, we admit that mental pleasures and pains spring from bodily pleasures and pains. And so I allow you what you allege, that anybody in our school, the Epicureans, who differs from this are out of court. And there are many people who do that, but they are unskilled thinkers, according to Torquatus. He says that mental pleasure brings us joy and mental pain brings us trouble, yet each of those arises from the body and is dependent on the body. So he's admitting that we're bodily creatures. We're all made of material things. So there's no spiritual or supernatural aspect to any of these things. But even though that's the case, that the mental depends on the bodily, what he says is this: it does not follow that the pleasures and pains of the mind don't greatly surpass those of the body. With the body, indeed, we can perceive only what is present to us at the moment, but with the mind, we can perceive the past and the future also. For granting that we feel just as great a pain when our body is in pain, still mental pain can be very greatly intensified if we imagine some everlasting and unbounded evil to be menacing us. And we can apply the same argument to pleasure, that it is increased by the absence of such fears. By this time, so much at least is plain. The intensest pleasure or the intensest annoyance of the mind exerts more influence on the happiness or wretchedness of life than either feeling when present for an equal space of time in the body. Let's deal with the relationship and weighing of pleasures of the mind versus pleasures of the body.
Let me read a quote from John Stuart Mill, actually two quotes. This is from his work from 1861 entitled Utilitarianism. And he says, human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. I do not indeed consider the Epicureans to have been by any means faultless in drawing out their scheme of consequences from the utilitarian principle. To do this in any sufficient manner, many Stoic as well as Christian elements require to be included. But there is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. And he follows it up with the famous quote, "It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." So in both cases here, both in Cicero and in John Stuart Mill, it's put here in quite stark terms that it couldn't possibly be more obvious to these people that mental pleasures, as even John Stuart Mill says, are ranked much higher in the hierarchy of pleasures than mere bodily sensation. The difficulty is the question, genuinely, as to whether that's authentic Epicureanism.
Right. And just to be clear about what you just read, John Stuart Mill was defending Epicurus and saying that Epicurus valued mental pleasures as much or more than bodily. Did I understand you correctly?
Oh, yeah, here. Yeah. There is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect a higher value than to those of mere sensation. And he totally, he's fully on board with that.
And so Torquatus is including that argument here as an important part of his presentation in response to what Cicero has already said, and also in anticipation of what Cicero is going to say further. He is stressing that it is indeed mental pleasure and pain that can be at least as important as the physical. And that is a huge accusation against the Epicureans, is that they're nothing more than pigs pursuing immediate bodily sensations. Now, at the same time, he has introduced this by saying that it's true that these are linked together. The mind is not something separate from the body. And mental pleasures and pains, he says, quote, spring from bodily pleasures and pains. So it's true that they are linked together, just like the body and the soul. They cannot be divorced from each other. But it is convenient for us as we talk about different types of pleasures and pains, just like we talk about ice cream versus apple pie, there are different types of experiences in life, and some of these we classify as mental, and some of them we classify as bodily.
Right. Now, there's a passage in Book 2 of Lucretius when he says that it is pleasant to stand on the shore and to behold the shipwreck, not because any person's misery is pleasurable to us, but because it is pleasant to see which dangers we ourselves are free from. And he says that
Mm-hmm.
it is pleasant to stand on a height and look over a battlefield as the armies crash against each other. Again, not because we like to see those people suffering or in torment, but because it's pleasant to be free from that ourselves. But then he goes on to say, nothing is more blissful than to occupy the heights effectively fortified by the teachings of the wise. The mind, divorced from anxiety and fear, may enjoy a feeling of contentment. And so the nature of the body evidently is such that it needs few things, namely those which banish pain, and in doing so succeed in bestowing pleasures in plenty. This terrifying darkness that enshrouds the mind must be dispelled not by the sun's rays and the dazzling darts of day, but by the study of the superficial aspect and underlying principle of nature. So if you were inclined to support this opinion, you would look right here in Book 2 of Lucretius as evidence for your claim. But it seems to me that maybe that some of these commentators are getting things somewhat wrong. And I say that because there's two different things going on here. You can read this at the most superficial level and say, well, okay, intellectual pleasures, pleasures of the mind, the pleasures of the memory, of doing the right thing, of moral sentiment, as John Stuart Mill said, these are higher, more elevated, higher up in the hierarchy in every way than those mere bodily sensations. You can kind of see where they get this idea. But there's another way to read it. And the other way to read it, in my opinion, is to say that it is the intellectual, it's the requirement of the intellectual aspect of the human being, that is where we have to do the hard work of removing the fear, right, and the delusion and the false beliefs about what happens when you die, beliefs about the gods, that is an intellectual process that has to be undertaken in order for you to make real headway in Epicurean philosophy. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the keenest pleasures that you can ever have are intellectual, right? It's just that the groundwork for the philosophy is intellectual. Would you say that's a fair interpretation, Cassius?
I certainly agree with the emphasis on the foundation being necessary to lay that before you can make intelligent decisions about the rest of it.
Yeah, reading Greek, that's the famous example usually associated with John Stuart Mill, that reading Greek is a far more intense pleasure than simply drinking wine or having sex or doing any of the other things we do with our bodies. Part of the problem for me is that so many of these intellectual pleasures are also rooted in bodily experience and
Yes.
bodily pleasures. We think of dying for a friend as being an intensely painful experience, and presumably it is. It depends on how you die. But there's also an adrenaline rush associated with that a lot of people would interpret as pleasurable. So there's not a fine line that you can cut through these things and divide them. I think that when Epicurus is on his deathbed writing this letter to Idomeneus, saying that it is the memory of past pleasures that sustains him in that moment, I don't think that that's a purely intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's, the body is affected by the experience that we have in the mind. Just like when you walk out of a movie theater, you have this sense of catharsis, but it's not just in your mind or in your intellect. Your body feels that too.
Joshua, this reminds me of what you were talking about 2 weeks ago in terms of how it's really off-putting and seems to be a really bad idea to try to substitute your judgment for what somebody else is actually experiencing. And if John Stuart Mill wants to tell me that reading Greek is the greatest pleasure in life, if that's the way he sees it, I'm not going to dispute his feelings within his mind and his body. But I guarantee you it is not my greatest pleasure in life to read Greek, and it never will be. And I think that's where you have to keep the whole atomic physics aspect of Epicurean philosophy in mind, that looking to some absolute standard of single rankings of experiences in life is just nonsense given the unintended and lack of supernatural design and so forth. It just doesn't make sense that everybody should reach the same conclusion about how to spend their lives. And even if you want to generalize and just say mental versus physical, That changes from moment to moment based on the situation you're in. Let's go ahead, Calthini.
As far as mental pleasures, there's the experience of flow when you're doing certain activities. Maybe when you're playing an instrument, you can really get into the flow of it. Or when you're dancing, you can just really get into the flow of it. And those actually are a combination of a physical and a mental, and also just a sense of timelessness. And when people are together with good friends, that some kind of activity that they're sharing could be both mental and physical, once again bringing about a sense of timelessness and a sense of bliss when you're both fully alive in your mind and your body. You're fully present. And in that sense, that would be living as blissfully as the gods.
Right. And, these are essential, essential pleasures. Maybe I shouldn't say they're essential, but these are excellent pleasures and they're worth pursuing. The difficulty for me is it is the act of a snob to say what John Stuart Mill says here, which is that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And the only reason the fool would have a different opinion is because the fool only knows his own side of the question. He doesn't know what Socrates knows. If only he had had the intelligence or the education or the wisdom of a Socrates, he would know what a miserable life he was leading. And I find that deeply off-putting. So, yeah, I think that, like I said, I think that the essential work of overcoming your fear of death, of overcoming your fear of punishment, or even of your hope of reward beyond the grave, that this has to be done, and it has to be done by the intelligence, because the body can't really do this. But to say that because of that the intellectual pleasure is purer or higher or more stimulating, I find a lot of problems with that approach.
It might be interesting to note that the way Torquatus says this here, he has a little bit of a caveat on the end. The sentence we've been stressing is, quote, by this time so much at least is plain, that the intensest pleasure or the intensest annoyance felt in the mind exerts more influence on the happiness or wretchedness of life than either feeling when present for an equal space of time in the body. That last phrase there is sort of a caveat, maybe that begins to address some of what you're raising, Joshua. He's not saying that mental pleasure or pain is necessarily always more important than physical, but he's limiting it to when present for an equal space of time in the body. So when present for an equal space of time is at least one factor in evaluating the mental versus the bodily.
Right. One of the other issues here that doesn't often get brought up is if the argument for pleasure as the good or as the telos comes to us from an observation of infants and of lower orders of animals, doesn't that kind of throw a wrench in the idea that intellectual pleasures are higher? Actually, this is interesting. I read on one of these science or technology websites just this morning a reporting on the results of a study in which they had taken a newborn infant and put it on this, what they called the mobile. And it's basically the baby is like strapped to this flat surface on the top of this thing. And it's got lines that go to cuffs around the baby's feet. And as the baby moves, it moves the right foot and the mobile goes backwards, and it moves the left foot and the mobile goes forwards. And the point of it was to find the moment at which the baby discovers that it has agency in moving this thing, right? That at the beginning, the movement is just purely random, right? Babies just kick. It's what they do. It's part of strengthening their limbs and so forth. But gradually, this infant realized that by moving its foot, it was causing the thing to move. And then it would go through periods where it would move and then it would stop and the machine would stop. So it's clear that the baby was developing some kind of awareness that its body was causing these changes in its environment. Anyway, I found that very interesting.
Well, I think it does reinforce how the physical and the mental work together. Certainly the Epicureans don't seem to be advocating that the mental is itself alone operating off and to the exclusion of the physical. And presumably sometimes you're going to accept in the standard calculation that sometimes you accept pain in order to experience a greater pleasure or avoid worse pain in the future. You're going to have the same kind of an interplay between physical and mental experiences. Sometimes you're going to trade mental pain for physical pleasure, and sometimes physical pain for mental pleasure, and they're totally connected. And maybe that is a bridge to the next point that he's making in the remainder of this section 17, which I think is significantly different. There's not much transition, but it gets back to the bigger picture. We've established in this section that we're not just talking about physical pleasure and pain. We're talking also about mental pleasure and pain. The next point Torquatus makes is we refuse to believe, however, that when pleasure is removed, grief instantly ensues, excepting when perchance pain takes the place of pleasure. But we think on the contrary that we experience joy on the passing away of pains, even though none of that kind of pleasure which stirs the senses has taken their place. And from this it may be understood how great a pleasure it is to be without pain. Now, that's maybe awkwardly worded, but I think it's taking us back to the central point that there's only pleasure and there's only pain. If you're not experiencing pain, you are experiencing pleasure. And I think what he's emphasizing here, that when pleasure is removed, pain instantly follows. I think I'm seeing that as an emphasis that unless you're experiencing some affirmative pain of the body or of the mind, say when you finish eating the apple pie or finish drinking the milkshake, just because you've finished that particular stimulating pleasure does not mean that pain takes its place. Only if you somehow specifically are exposed to a particular pain will pain take the place of that pleasure which is left, because there are so many pleasures in life, the pleasure of existing without pain, that every time you withdraw a particular stimulus of pleasure does not mean that pain is going to take its place. These other pleasures of life will take the place of that pleasure unless there's some specific pain that's bothering you. What do you think about that? Do you see another way of interpreting that sentence?
Well, I'm glad you made that commentary, Cassius, because I thought your analysis was excellent, because the surface reading of this is that there are three states almost, is what that's what he's almost inviting you to conclude here. But I think you pointed out that no, what he's actually talking about here are essentially it's that difference between the kinetic and the catastematic, which are words we don't use very often on the podcast. That when you remove these active stimuli that provoke a response of pleasure, when you remove those, there still is pleasure. As you said, the pleasure of living without pain. So it's very good to clarify what he says there, because it is very awkwardly worded.
Yeah, you know how reluctant I am to talk about kinetic and catastematic. But I bet it would be interesting to look at the Latin here and see if there's any differences in the Latin word for pleasure here, because this is the issue that Cicero is going to jump all over, is that the word pleasure is a sweeping word that includes all sorts of types of experiences, the roller coaster, the sex, drugs, rock and roll, but it also includes just the pleasure of being alive without pain, the pleasure of thinking that you're standing up and you're not 6 feet under the ground, the pleasure of all the different memories and appreciations of the things that you have in your life. And so those are very different types of pleasures, but they still fall under this category of pleasure itself. Cicero and the anti-Epicureans are just trying to hammer this point that pleasure means nothing other than these affirmative stimulations of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And they're trying to argue that when you withdraw sex, drugs, and rock and roll, then you're in pain or you're in nothingness. But the Epicurean position seems to stand or fall on this issue that if you're not experiencing pain, then life in the absence of pain is pleasurable no matter what you're doing. As long as you're not in pain and you're alive, you're experiencing pleasure from this perspective.
So it does take some contemplation to really see that when there's not an active stimulation happening, in other words, you're not eating food, you're not listening to beautiful music, and then you're also not feeling any kind of pain in your body because you're feeling good health, so there's no painful stimulation coming into your body. It does take a little bit of practice to observe that really is a pleasurable state, because we're rushing around in life that we're bombarded by sensations, either it's pleasure or pain. And just as Epicurus says, there are only two feelings. And then yet there is this whole argument, well, what about the middle ground? My point is that it's almost as if it is a practice of the mind to observe when there's no sensation present, that is a pleasure, and that it does take some time for your thoughts to sit on that and say, is this true? Is this really true that I'm feeling pleasure? It's like, it's an attitude of viewing the world and viewing your internal experience that does take a bit of thinking.
Yeah, I agree, Colosini. And it's clear that Cicero is coming down on the side that that's not the case, or he seems to be. But yeah, I think you're completely right. There are two cautions I would make here in response to this reading. And that is, it's not the case that everyone who, at the moment you stop eating ice cream, that you are still experiencing pleasure, because that's kind of the background state of not being in pain, not experiencing illness or sickness. Some people, when they stop eating ice cream, they do go right back into pain, because they have depression or anxiety or some of these other issues. And I wouldn't discount those as being just as important as bodily pain in causing suffering. So there's that side of the equation, but that's still not a middle ground. It's just that, the ice cream is a temporary reprieve from the mental pain or anguish that people are already experiencing, and that they need to find help with dealing with. The other side of the equation is there is no moral imperative. Once you get to the point where you are no longer experiencing any pain and that you are now experiencing pleasure, there's no moral imperative to stop there. You can still go on and experience, and are invited to experience, any number of additional sources of pleasure, just because I'm not experiencing any pain, so that's it. Lucretius said that there's nothing more blissful than to occupy the heights effectively fortified by the teachings of the wise. So I'm going to go sit on a mountaintop and live a life without pain, and that's it. That's all I'm ever going to do ever again. But that imperative does not exist in Epicurean philosophy. Once you get to a point where you're not experiencing pain, fear, or anxiety, then you are invited, as Henry David Thoreau said, to adventure on life. That's your purpose now. Once your basic needs have been met, then is the time to indulge in all of those little experiences and big experiences that give us pleasure. It's how you enrich your life. And it makes it just that much more worth living.
Okay, and I would agree emphatically with what Colosini said, and also what you said, Joshua. To go back to what Colosini said, it touches on, again, what we talked about 2 weeks ago in terms of what's really going on here with Epicurean philosophy. There's effort that's involved in understanding and learning and appreciating this perspective on life, that life is desirable in itself. As Epicurus says, life is pleasurable unless you're in pain. That's why Cicero is making such hay of this argument. That's not the way people often think. They are often looking for sex, drugs, and rock and roll and limiting the word pleasure to that. But if they do limit the word pleasure to that, they are not going to be successful in achieving a life full of sex, drugs, and rock and roll alone. What Joshua said in terms of occupying the heights of philosophy, and that nothing is more pleasurable than that. You can't go climb to the top of that mountain and just sit there and do nothing, because you're going to get hungry. You're going to get cold. Somebody's going to come maybe try to knock you off the top of the mountain. You simply cannot just take a mental position that through the strength of your willpower, as if you were some stoic, that you can be aloof from everything that's going on around you, because the world's not going to let you do that. You have to act to sustain, even apparently as the gods of Epicurus have to act to sustain their own immortality. If Epicurean philosophy is anything, it's realistic about the way the world is. You can climb to the top of the mountain. You can sit there. You can say, I have no pain, but that's not going to last very long for any person in the real world. And Epicurus seems to me to be stressing the reality of how the world works and how your mind works with it. If you reach a certain perspective and understanding of pleasure and pain, you can reconcile all this and come to a coherent explanation of what life is all about. And so much of this does revolve around the definition of the word pleasure. I changed on the forum this morning the opening quote on the first page to emphasize this point. It's something that Cicero is going to say at the beginning of Book 2, but it's very relevant to what we're discussing. Cicero has alleged that Epicurus doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about pleasure the way he does. And so in response to that, Torquatus says, "Come, that's a good joke," Torquatus said, "that the author of the doctrine that pleasure is the end of things desirable and the final and ultimate good does not actually know what manner of thing pleasure itself is." And Cicero says in response to that, well, Cicero replied, either Epicurus does not know what pleasure is, or the rest of mankind all the world over does not. With the point being that Cicero is trying to limit pleasure and saying that everybody thinks of pleasure as only these stimulating things. And Epicurus's definition of pleasure is wrong and should not be accepted. Every time I read this material, I have a greater appreciation of, I think, how clear it is that this is really the heart of the question as Cicero is identifying it here. Do you take Epicurus's position that life in the absence of pain is pleasure, or do you take the position that pleasure is sex, drugs, and rock and roll? And if Cicero's right and pleasure is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, then pleasure cannot be understood to be the ultimate good of life. But if you take a wider view, that pleasure is everything mental and physical that is desirable in life, that we find desirable naturally through our feeling of pleasure, then it makes perfect sense what Epicurus is saying. There's no mystery, there's no darkness, there's no esoteric thing that nobody can understand. But that's what Cicero's trying to say here, that Epicurus makes no sense. It's totally beyond human comprehension to accept that Epicurus is correct. And the more you study and the more you really dig into these exchanges, you see that that's the battleground and the real fight that's going on.
Right. And Torquatus takes up the summation of everything we've been talking about with great eloquence here in the beginning of section 18. He says, "What a noble and open and plain and straight avenue to a happy life, it being certain that nothing can be better for man than to be relieved of all pain and annoyance, and to have full enjoyment of the greatest pleasures, both of mind and of body. Do you not see how nothing is neglected which assists our life more easily to attain that which is its aim, the supreme good? Epicurus, the man whom you charge with being an extravagant devotee of pleasures, cries aloud that no one can live agreeably unless he lives a wise, moral, and righteous life, and that no one can live a wise, moral, and righteous life without living agreeably. It is not possible for a community to be happy when there is rebellion, nor for a house when its masters are at strife. Much less can a mind at disaccord and at strife with itself taste any portion of pleasure undefiled and unimpeded." There's an echo of Abraham Lincoln in there, isn't there? A house divided against itself cannot stand. I wonder if he had this passage in mind.
And Joshua, continuing on, the part that you stopped reading goes back to this other point that we're discussing about mental versus physical again. It says, "Nay more, if the mind is always beset by desires and designs which are recalcitrant and irreconcilable, it can never see a moment's rest or a moment's peace. But if agreeableness of life is thwarted by the more serious bodily diseases, how much more must it inevitably be thwarted by the diseases of the mind?" Now, the diseases of the mind are the measureless and false passions for riches, fame, power, and even for the lustful pleasures. To these are added griefs, troubles, sorrows, which devour the mind and wear it away with anxiety, because men do not comprehend that no pain should be felt in the mind which is unconnected with an immediate or impending bodily pain.
He says, "There is also death, which always hangs over them like the stone over Tantalus."
Right.
And against superstition, which prevents those who are tinged by it from ever being able to rest.
This is the concluding section here that really is powerfully written. "Neither can any fool be happy, nor any wise man fail to be happy." And we advocate these views far better and with much greater truth than do the Stoics, since they declare that nothing good exists except that vague phantom which they call morality, a title imposing rather than real, and that virtue being founded on this morality demands no pleasure and is satisfied with her own resources for the attainment of happiness. But we too can use the word virtue and state it in a way that actually agrees with Epicurus, because that's the way Epicurus represents the wise man as continuously happy. This is another very good summary of what the Epicureans are suggesting is the best way of life. For this is the way in which Epicurus represents the wise man as continually happy. He keeps his passions within bounds. About death he is indifferent. He holds true views concerning the eternal gods, apart from all dread. He has no hesitation in crossing the boundary of life, if that be the better course. Furnished with these advantages, he is continuously in a state of pleasure, and there is in truth no moment at which he does not experience more pleasures than pains. For he remembers the past with thankfulness, and the present is so much his own that he is aware of its importance and its agreeableness. Nor is he in dependence on the future, but waits it while enjoying the present. He is also very far removed from those defects of character which I quoted a little time ago, and when he compares the fool's life with his own, he feels great pleasure. And pains, if any befall him, have never power enough to prevent the wise man from finding more reasons for joy than for vexation. It was indeed excellently said by Epicurus that fortune only in a small degree crosses the wise man's path, and that his greatest and most important undertakings are executed in accordance with his own design and his own principles, and no greater pleasure can be reaped from a life which is without end in time than is reaped from this which we know to have its allotted end. Boy, that's kind of a summary of a lot of the material in the letter to Menorchius and the principal doctrines. Very well stated. Okay, maybe we should begin to bring today's episode to a conclusion. So let's go around and see if anybody has comments. Calasini, any closing comments today?
Yes, you were just reading a section there which had these words: the agreeableness of the present, and then more reasons for joy than vexation. And I guess that would be the description of the wise man.
For he remembers the past with thankfulness, and the present is so much his own that he is aware of its importance and its agreeableness. And then continuing on, and any pains, if any befall him, have never power enough to prevent the wise man from finding more reason for joy than for vexation. Okay, Joshua.
Yeah, so since we were talking about John Stuart Mill earlier and some of his ideas about not just pleasure, but wisdom and morality and so forth, I wanted to quote Charles Darwin here in The Descent of Man. He says, Mr. John Stuart Mill speaks in his celebrated work Utilitarianism, that I quoted above, of the social feelings as a powerful natural sentiment and as the natural basis of sentiment for utilitarian morality. Again, he says, like the other acquired capacities above referred to, the moral faculty, if not a part of our nature, is a natural outgrowth from it, capable, like them, in a certain small degree of springing up spontaneously. But, says Charles Darwin, in opposition to all this, he also remarks, if, as is my own belief, the moral feelings are not innate but acquired, they are not for that reason less natural. And then Darwin says, it is with hesitation that I venture to differ at all from so profound a thinker. But it can hardly be disputed that the social feelings are instinctive or innate in the lower animals. And why should they not be so in man? And then he quotes another 19th century thinker whose last name is Bain. He says, Mr. Bain and others believe that the moral sense is acquired by each individual during his lifetime. On the general theory of evolution, this is at least extremely improbable. The ignoring of all transmitted mental qualities will, it seems to me, be hereafter judged as a most serious blemish in the works of Mr. Mill. I bring that up because, again, I kind of think that John Stuart Mill is a bit of a snob when it comes to some of these issues. He says that intellectual pleasures are superior to physical pleasures, that no theory of Epicureanism, which is consistent, can possibly hold otherwise. And then he goes on to say that social feelings, sociability and morality, that these things do not exist in nature or in lower orders. They exist in man and are developed in the individual during the course of his lifetime. In other words, that it's culture, that it's society, that it's education, that this is what produces moral sentiment. And I realize moral sentiment is not really the theme of our conversation today, but I totally am on board with what Charles Darwin has to say. And I think that his side has won out, that lower orders of animals are just as capable of behaving selflessly as we are, and that lower orders of animals are just as capable of sociability as we are. And that's important to me because Epicurus founds his understanding of pleasure on not just infants who have no culture, who have no education, who have not been civilized, but also on these lower orders of animals. So I think John Stuart Mill gets quite a lot wrong here. And it's actually very nice to see that Charles Darwin takes him to task on that.
Yeah, Joshua, I agree with what you've said. And I think that does put a point on the issues we've been discussing today, in that we need to be looking at all these questions in the widest possible context, looking mainly to nature as the source of our ultimate answers, but realizing that there are other suggestions of other types of answers out there that other people are advocating, whether it's based on piety to the gods or virtue or some kind of ideal behavior. There are competing theories of how you should look at life and how you should organize your life. And ultimately, what Epicurus is doing is saying that you look at nature, you look at the rest of the things around you, and you don't just let your own mind carry you away into something that has no natural evidence to support it. Going back to Frances Wright's commentary, she interestingly focuses on, quote, the imagination as the source of this issue. That the imagination can be extremely pleasurable, productive to life, and just an absolutely important part of human experience, but it needs to be tempered by judgment and prudence about what you allow it to do and how you allow it to influence your life. There are all sorts of things that you can imagine, such as John Stuart Mill's taking the greatest pleasure in Greek, and all sorts of mental constructs you can imagine in life, but you have to understand that you are a part of a natural universe that your mind does not control. And you cannot simply climb to the top of that mountain and sit there and expect to not freeze to death or die of starvation or lack of water or any of the other things that will naturally limit your ability for your imagination to carry your way. So much of all this seems to come back to this definition of pleasure. This is where Cicero has chosen to focus his argument. He thinks there's this opening here that he can convince people that looking at pleasure widely, as Epicurus is doing, is ridiculous and unworthy of men, and it is going to allow him to defeat Epicurus's argument. And so that's where we cannot allow pleasure to be restricted to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We have to take a wider view of it so that we can then understand how to defeat these other arguments based on religion or idealism that has no foundation in nature. Okay, thanks for your time this week. We'll be back soon. Bye.